everybody, and welcome to our February episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Connecticut State Archaeologist Sarah Sportman, and I'm joined tonight by my co-host Scott Brady, President of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology.
Hi, Sarah. I'm really excited about the show tonight and the kind of line that we want to take with some of our future shows. Can we talk a little bit about that just while we get our guest on the line?
Yeah, so tonight is the first in a series of shows we're going to do throughout the year, this year, focusing on archaeologists from Connecticut who work in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think that, there's so much great and interesting archaeology being done by, I'll call them Connecticut-based archaeologists that, we haven't talked about up till now. I'm really excited to see where we take this.
Yeah, and at our universities we have a lot of archaeologists working in different parts of the world that are teaching students that end up working here locally and also in places abroad. So tonight we're going to be joined by a special guest, Dr. Christian Tryon, who's a professor of anthropology at UConn in Storrs. Hi, Christian.
Hello.
So glad you could join us tonight. So, I'll just give a little bit of a brief overview, and then maybe you can kind of tell us a little bit more about yourself. But Christian's archaeological research focuses on human evolution, and much of his work has been in East Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania. He's a specialist in the analysis of stone tools, and he also studies volcanic ashes, which are used in many parts of the world to date archaeological sites. More recently, he's been working with archives and archaeological collections, applying new approaches to old data sets. So I guess to start out, you were born and raised in Connecticut. You went to school here. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got started in archaeology?
Sure. I was actually born and partially raised in North Carolina and moved to Connecticut when I was about 12. So we can sort of split that difference. But, in terms of how I got interested in archaeology, I'm a child of the 80s. Indiana Jones was a big deal, right? And so there was a book that came out by a famous archaeologist named Brian Fagan called Adventures in Archaeology that National Geographic published. And they took the font of Indiana Jones and everything, and I still have my copy. That was a big deal getting that book for, I think it must have been for Christmas or birthday or something. So that was a big deal. And then also I went to a magnet school, and in 6th grade, this would have been 1986 or 7, so Indiana Jones was still, again, big in the theaters. I actually took a class in archaeology in 6th grade. Now, I still have one of my papers from that class. I covered, I think it was called From the Amoebas. No, it was something about amoebas to the Crusades in about 3 pages of handwritten, stuff. So we covered a lot, but it maintained my interest in it, and it sort of stayed as a background level thing of liking, history and things related to history ever since.
So when you started college, did you immediately go and know that you were going to be an archaeologist, or did you start out with something else and kind of just fall into it?
Yes and no. I think I switched majors about 8 times in about 2 months. I kept going. I couldn't decide if I was an English major, an art history major, a history major, an anthropology major. There may have been something else in there that I can't even remember now. But I do know that what made a big impression on me was when I visited UConn before. I was there as an undergraduate, right? And a faculty member who's still a faculty member, Kevin McBride, was there. And I had no one else showed up. It was just me and him, and then my dad had come with me. And sitting down, looking at things, seeing how archaeology was done was really inspiring. So that made a big impression on me. That sort of solidified that archaeology was something I was really interested in. But I've maintained an interest in all those other fields as well. So
can you tell us about some of the work that you did locally in Connecticut earlier in your career?
For sure. I got my start, again, because of meeting Professor McBride. I got interested in the sort of hands-on, the local aspects of archaeology. And I took part in an archaeological field school that was run in 1994, which is a phenomenal year to do it because there were a number of projects going on by different faculty and graduate students, including Brian Jones at that time, who was still working on his PhD. So you had a chance to work on a Paleo-Indian site, which at that time I thought was too old and boring. You had a chance to work on a Middle Woodland site about 2,000 years ago. You had a chance to work on the Pequot Reservation on a 16th, 17th century, now I've forgotten, site. And then you had a chance, the one I really enjoyed is working on Block Island on a what must be 17th century for it there, and I spent several weeks after the field school doing that as well. So it was a great introduction to sort of hands-on archaeology of the region, and really in time periods, in historical time periods, what at that time sort of excited me most because of the kinds of questions you could ask that you can't really ask in the really, really deep time, because you just don't have the level of data or sort of resolution of the data available.
You know, it's, Block Island in the summer sounds like a pretty good deal to me too. I think that would have been my first choice.
Oh, it was great. I mean, we stayed in the Historical Society's house. It was just us. It was amazing. That I would happily work there again in a heartbeat.
Wow, yeah, that'd be pretty hard to be.
Yeah.
So, how did you decide to end up, pursuing a graduate degree in archaeology and switching gears away from New England?
Well, in terms of a graduate degree in archaeology, I mean, I feel like my sort of background, my skill sets coming out of high school and early college didn't suit a lot of other options. It turns out that being like a record collector and a dungeon master aren't really good skill sets for the working world. But in academia, being able to retain lots of information is really good. And so I found that I enjoyed archaeology. I liked being outside. I liked puzzles. I liked digging. All those sort of things came together as a way to sort of investigate the past that seemed to fit the skill set that I did have. And so that's how I sort of went into pursuing graduate school. I changed directions a little bit, although I still very much I've always had a deep love for the Archaeology of Connecticut. I mean, I forgot to say, my undergraduate sort of honors thesis was doing a big project that sort of intersected archaeology and geology and looking at the movement of stone tools all around the Northeast. We were finding things at sites in Connecticut that were also coming from places in New Jersey. So I was interested in these sort of bigger questions about movement and connections. But I sort of fell into a new faculty member at the time, and this is in the mid-'90s, Sally McBrearty, who had just come to UConn, who was doing sort of the archaeology of human evolution, doing work in Kenya, and I really enjoyed the classes I took with her. I spent a lot of time talking to her outside of classes. I took a graduate class with her after I graduated, just sort of a part-time student, and that led to the opportunities to go and work with her in the field, and that it just sort of opened a whole new range of possibilities that I hadn't really considered otherwise. So it was a happy accident in some ways.
Yeah, Sally was a fantastic faculty member. I took a number of classes with her when I was in grad school as well, and a lot of that information, site formation processes, and human evolutionary theory, and all of that has really stuck with me. And I think, particularly the site formations class, which was, I think, probably the most important one I ever took, has really shaped a lot of the ways that I think about things.
For myself, I think site formation was the least interesting thing to me. Now I think it's the most important and coolest part of the sites that we're on. So I've come around to that way of thinking.
Yeah, definitely. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've done in human evolution in Kenya and Tanzania, and some of the sites that you've worked on there?
Yeah, I mean, there's too many. I mean, I do too many things. I mean, so and now a lot of my effort is really thinking about sites in the Mediterranean as well. And so the work in Kenya and Tanzania. I mean, some of the main projects I had done, a lot of them were in the Rift Valley, because that's a great place to look if you're interested in human evolution. This is a great place to look. I mean, in part because it seems like our human ancestors had been there the longest, but also because the evidence is there in the sense that, it's the Rift Valley, so the Earth is sort of pulling itself apart. There's ancient sediments being exposed, things are getting buried, volcanoes are burying them. So it was a good place to sort of look. And so I had fallen into a project, this is one that Sally McBrearty had been directing, trying to piece out the archaeological evidence for what was going on at about the time when our own species, Homo sapiens, showed up. And there seemed to be some major changes in the ways people were making and using stone tools, but the sort of order of events, the chronology, sort of what was going on, wasn't very clear. So a lot of that work was using the volcanic ashes to sort of order archaeological sites and figure out what we were able to show, I think reasonably well, is that you do have this sort of major change in behavior at about the time our own species shows up. Different kinds of tools being made, more complex tools, things being moved around quite a bit. So I did that for a while, and a number of other projects in the Rift Valley. For a number of years, I was involved, and still am tangentially involved, in a project looking around the shores of Lake Victoria, the Kenyan portions of the shore. So this is the biggest lake in Africa. I think it's like the second biggest freshwater body in the world. But what's really exciting about it is, from a geological standpoint, that thing is dry most of the time. The biggest lake in Africa is sort of an epiphenomenon from a geological standpoint. When it dries up, all kinds of different things happen. You've got a Serengeti expanding. It turns out you've got all kinds of weird extinct animals running around the landscape until even 12,000 years ago. So a lot of work was looking at reconstructing those environments, looking from sort of extinct animals and how humans sort of fit into that story. And then within the last, I'd say, decade, well, exactly a decade, I have a 10-year-old daughter, my sort of strategy shifted away from sort of field efforts to sort of collections-based research. And this comes from a place where, museums are full of boxes of stuff that somebody dug up, shoved into a corner, never looked at again. And this is basically a complete waste of the archaeological record, right? Once you excavate a site, once you collect something, you've removed it from its original context. You've essentially destroyed a part of it. And so we have a real obligation to do something about that. And so I was involved in a number of projects in Kenya and then now in Tanzania on sites that have either been largely unpublished or were in a massive need of a reevaluation in terms of how old they really were. And so those efforts have led to the construction of a key sort of stratigraphic sequence for the last 50, 70,000 years at a site called Kasese 2 in Tanzania, and then sort of redating some early human remains at a site called Lukenya Hill in Kenya. And from these grew ideas about developing sort of new ways to date things. I mean, evolution is basically about change over time. So if you don't have your sort of temporal scale in order, you're kind of making stuff up. And so developing new ways to date weird things, right? Archaeologists are into weird things. And so helping be part of a team to develop what's called uranium series dating, but it's applied to ostrich eggshell fragments. These are parts of people's diet, things they made stuff with, but they preserve really well. So did that. And then a lot of projects lately have been, like I said, looking at other museum collections, but ones that are based in the U.S., but sites that are around the Mediterranean basin. So sites in Lebanon, sites in Israel. I did a number of work there, and I'm working now with some colleagues to get some projects off the ground, or taking part in existing projects that are in the sort of Rhone Valley of southern France, and then, with luck, a project in Sicily as well. So quite a bit of different things going on.
Yeah, definitely. Would you mind, I think that, our listeners have kind of a varied, I think, understanding and knowledge of archaeology here and abroad. But I think it would be really interesting to get into a little bit more to some of the things that you kind of covered briefly and talked about a little bit. So, just in terms of, maybe we can kind of go chronologically through your career and start with the human evolution things, move on to the Teffer stratigraphy, and maybe just cover some of these things in a little bit of detail to kind of, let people know how it all works, because it is very different than most of the archaeology that we talk about here. You're dealing with very deep time, very different site formation processes in a lot of contexts. And it'd be great to kind of have some, comparative context for that.
Yeah, I think one of the things some of the listeners might be interested in is, you were talking about, as modern humans, as we come on the landscape, who else is there to greet them?
You've just opened a huge can of worms. This is a wonderful question. No, but it comes down to, within the last decade, there's been major changes, right? I mean, the sort of classic way of thinking about who's out there is grounded in sort of classification. I mean, ways of classifying things that go back to Linnaeus. What's a genus, what's a species, all these sorts of things. What's complex? We talk about Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, sort of classic species things. What the ancient DNA has shown is that things are really messy, right? So it's clear that we, Homo sapiens, could interbreed successfully with Neanderthals. So what does that mean? The definition of a species is we shouldn't be able to reproduce and make viable offspring. So what's a species has become a very complicated question. It's clear that there's a lot of different hominins, early humans and our ancestors, running around the landscape that are probably very distinct on some scale, whether we call them species or whatnot, is a big debate right now, I think, in anthropology. But I think the real punchline is that the way we are in the world now, as diverse as we are in the world, we're all still the same species. I mean, I think in this sense we're quite clear. We're all Homo sapiens. That's really weird. In the history of the planet, in the history of our own sort of lineage, for most of it's only in the last, let's say, 10, 12, maybe 20,000 years that's the case. That for most of human history, there have been other human lineages or species or whatever we want to call them running around on the landscape. And whether that's on a global scale or within Africa is something people are still trying to work out. But the problem with answering that is that, as anthropologists, we know that people are weird. Everybody's a little bit different, does things differently. And so, if you were to draw any one person out of a crowd and say, okay, you're the representative for our species, a lot of people are going to be resistant, right? Because we all might have different ideas about how we perceive things. For the fossils, you're often picking one fossil that is the only one you've got for maybe the next, several 100,000 miles around you in the next several million years. And so we don't really have a good sense of variation. And so I think the landscape was messy, but how to really answer that is something people are investigating. I hope that's not too wishy-washy an answer, because that's a great question.
No, I think it's a really fine answer, and I think that the other part that really fascinates me is we have these different subgroups, species, whatever you want to call them, but it seems like they all, whether it's in the Rift Valley or in different places in the world, all kind of fall upon the same inventions or technologies in some way, shape, or form. Is that something?
Go ahead.
Yeah, is that something that you see in your research?
Yeah, definitely. This is a tricky thing, in that there are debates back and forth about to what extent different technologies are really distinctive of particular groups. I mean, in living humans, we know that's not the case. People can adopt the same favorite brand of, automobile or whatever and live in very different parts of the world, right? The things we have don't really define who we are in an essential sense. We do see the same technologies being invented the world over. I mean, a lot of the things that we have to study in the deep time, right, stone tools, these sorts of things, I mean, they're probably the functional equivalents of, like, the hammers and screwdrivers of today. They might not have been very important to people's social world. These were probably sort of problem-solving things. And, it seems that people probably found the same ways to solve that same problem. You want to hammer something? Well, the shape of a hammer is something that people probably figured out independently multiple times. And so you do see the same sort of forms of tools cropping up again and again. And sometimes it might be because a successful tool type was invented and somebody, saw their neighbors doing it and they copied it, and then their neighbor copied it and it moved on sort of that way. But it's also probably the case that people figured out that, you want something sharp and pointy, well, a triangle is the best shape. And so there's a lot of sharp, triangular, pointy stone tools out there, right? Conversions.
So, I know I don't want to get too far into the weeds on, human capabilities and technology and culture and all of that, but, can we take this discussion a little bit farther about how the study of ancient stone tools helps us to understand human evolution and how, people changed, people adapted to different environments, people moved around. How do stone tools fit into that?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I like about stone tools, there's a couple of real sort of boring, or let's say prosaic, sounds fancier, reasons to study stone tools. They're rocks, right? So they preserve. Right. So just from a statistical standpoint, there are tons, millions and millions of stone tools out there. And so that's good. So like I just said, for fossils, they're super rare. From just a numbers game, working with stone tools is going to tell us something useful. The other thing about stone tools that's nice is that they're kind of snapshots, right? You might use them and make them, it could be just hours or minutes that are being preserved. Where if you look at a fossil, you've got all kinds of different things going on, right? My legs are the shape the way they are, in part because my ancestors have been walking upright for millions of years. It's not actually telling you a whole lot about me as it is my ancestors. You might do chemical analyses of my teeth to tell what I ate, but you're getting the signal of what I've been eating over the last 30 or 40 years, not what I had last night. You might look at tiny scratches on my teeth to tell what I've been eating, but again, you're getting these sort of average signals where the tools are really giving you these snapshots you don't get from the fossils. So they are sort of complementary in that way, right? They give you kind of information that you can combine with the fossils. The other nice thing about stone tools is they sort of preserve in a weird way the actions that people did, the choices they made. So when you make a stone tool, you're taking a rock and you're breaking it with another rock. Well, the shape of that piece that's splintered off is sort of characteristic. You can sort of tell, oh, they chose to break it with their right hand, swinging from a high angle with a high force blow. And if you can do all those sort of choices and look at different things people made, it's like, I'm trying to think what a good analogy might be. It's sort of like sculpting, but you can reverse the sculpting. You can reverse engineer it because the stone tools sort of preserve the things that people did in interesting ways. And so they give you kind of insights into what people were doing, maybe cognitive abilities, right? This is a little shakier ground sometimes, but they can certainly show you what they did. If you can do things like certain rock types that people preferred might be chemically very distinctive, and so you can tell where they got them from. Sometimes people are moving bits of stone hundreds of miles across the landscape, right? Maybe this is because people were highly nomadic, or maybe because people traded with neighbors, or these things were valued for other reasons. So it's a lot of things. There are sort of social things you can get at stone tools that you might not get from other kinds of materials.
You're bringing up the nomadic and the lithics moving across the landscape. I mean, what you saw in Africa, is that what you saw in Connecticut? How was it similar? How was it dissimilar? Because we find, obviously, non-local materials all across New England. But I don't know.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, it's a great question, because I remember when I first started investigating, some of the work I was doing in Eastern Africa, I was looking at the movement of these stone tools, and they were several hundred kilometers. And at the time, the thinking was this was trade. This was early development of sort of trade networks, these really important social things. And at the time, I was now I'm going to blank on the names. I was talking to a Paleo-Indian, didn't a Stanford, Smithsonian. I was talking to him about that, and he said, well, for us in the Paleo-Indian period, that's just high mobility, right? I mean, so it's really difficult to tell. We can measure, from a scientific standpoint, we can show with some confidence usually that this rock came from this geological place, and we can measure that distance. But figuring out how it got there is really hard. I mean, so in some of the sites in New England, and this is the stuff I did as an undergraduate, I think we showed fairly conclusively that certain kinds of rocks, and these were particular kinds of a rock called hornfels, were coming from places in New Jersey, right? And other rocks called jasper are coming from places probably in eastern Pennsylvania. A lot of the chert comes from New York State. These things are moving long distances, and one way that you can get a sense of are they sort of moving in, are they trade, or how are they coming in, is the extent to which you find kind of finished goods versus just sort of raw materials in these things. And it seems these things were coming in a mixed bag. So there were probably fairly regular trade networks across New England and the Northeast, certainly by a couple of thousand years ago.
Can I grab you one more question on lithics,
Yeah.
and then maybe I'll be quiet for a minute and let you talk? Here in New England, I think in my experience when I'm excavating, I'm finding napping debris, right? That classic, flip it over, thin this side, flip. And I know that in a lot of other places, in particular out from Africa, there was a lot of core blade technology. Is that something that we're missing here? Do you think it's here in New England and it's harder to find, or is that kind of an exclusive thing that we don't see here in New England versus other places?
That's a great question. I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, you sometimes see what you look for. I mean, what am I trying to say? It is interesting. One of the things I like most about working in different places is you encounter very different sort of traditions or ways of thinking about things. And so it was exciting. I'm going to come back to the answer in a moment, but we had, there was a German PhD student doing an exchange here last year who started studying some Connecticut archaeological assemblages, and he came at it with a very different viewpoint. So I think that, yes, there are things that if we approach the record in Connecticut from a perspective of teams working elsewhere, I think we will find different things. I think it's a matter of sort of broadening the way we look, sort of broadening maybe the sort of range of examples to compare it to or think about. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I know this is work, so people like David Leslie, right, who's also done extensive work in East Africa certainly sees things, I think, in the lithic record that someone who hadn't had that kind of international experience might not. It's not to say that someone's better or worse at lithic analysis, but they're drawing on a different body of things to compare it to. So yeah, I think there's a lot of it really, and it goes both ways. There are certainly things that I learned to see in the Connecticut record that if I didn't have that background, I would have never seen in the record in East Africa or anywhere else. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that kind of exchange.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Those perspectives, and I think that having Dave in the region has been useful in a lot of ways because he does take kind of a different perspective when he looks at lithic assemblages, and that it's resulted in some pretty interesting results. And I think that in general we tend to have a tendency here in New England still to really be kind of caught up on typology and diagnostic projectile point styles and things like that, and we don't pay as much attention to the other parts of the lithic record and what that means and what people are doing. And I think we think about like time periods like the early Archaic here, where finally people are starting to pay more attention to the possibility of the Gulf of Maine Archaic tradition, which lacks a distinctive, definitive bifacial tool that everybody can kind of glom onto. So I think we have some growing pains to do here in our lithic analysis in the region. But I think that people with different perspectives who've worked in different areas definitely can add a lot and maybe kind of give us a little bit of a shot in the arm, because we do tend to get a little bit provincial in our interpretations.
Go ahead.
It just occurred to me, we're talking about the difference between like napping an individual tool versus that core blade technology, and some listeners might not know. Does anybody? I don't want to try and explain it because I'll muck it up. Could someone else maybe offer an explanation so they understand the difference between those two styles?
I can make a stab. I mean, so there's different ways of cracking open rocks to make things. And one approach is to use that to sort of peel off. Think of like slicing an apple. That might be the best analogy for sort of a blade core technology, right? Take an apple core, run it down, and you end up with a bunch of sort of wedge-shaped or maybe elongated things that come sort of pre-made with sharp edges. The other version is then now sort of shaping that into something like an arrowhead. So one is sort of making a thing that you then use right away, and the blades are often they're things that are long and thin. And then napping or shaping is you've got sort of an idea of what you want to do, and you're shaping that piece you've removed into something with a more particular shape, whether it's something like an arrowhead or something like that, where you've now had to sculpt it a bit more. Does that seem a reasonable description?
I mean, in my head, I can imagine that. I think the apple analogy was a really good one. I'm going to steal that, by the way. I'll give you credit the first two times, then it's going to be my idea.
I probably stole it from my wife, so let's give her full credit.
So I guess another thing that I wanted to talk a little bit more about as we move through this is kind of, the differences and sort of the challenges of doing archaeology in New England versus in East Africa. I mean, one obviously is the difference in scale. The time span is dramatically different, right? We're dealing with roughly 13,000 years here of human habitation, as opposed to a couple 100,000 or millions if you get into, human ancestors. So, just talking about some of the ways that you approach archaeology differently in those two landscapes would be really interesting to talk about, because we think here, primarily everything here is below ground, needs to be excavated. Sometimes we can find surface collections in plowed fields and things like that where you can walk around and artifacts have been moved up and down by the plow and you can pick them up and get a good indication that there's a site in that area. But it's a very different landscape in East Africa, obviously. So can you talk a little bit about some of the differences in how people do archaeology in these two environments and the challenges of both?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of differences, and it's also striking in some ways, this basic archaeology is the same everywhere. You're right about the landscape being one key difference, and at least in the time periods that I work, in the older time periods, you're often focusing on sort of what are basically badlands, places where the landscape's already sort of eroding and exposing ancient sediments that, are containing fossils or artifacts that pop out, rather than, New England is often exploratory by sort of subsurface shovel and digging a hole in the ground, looking for stuff, right, hoping to find it that way. where, at least in the parts of Eastern Africa where I've worked, and I don't want to generalize too much, but we often, site discovery, if you're not looking for a cave or a rock shelter, it's often looking where the erosion is, where erosion exposes the ancient sediments. And then once you find stuff, then the next trick is to sort of do excavation to locate where those things are eroding from, where they're sort of popping out of the ground. And so you see a lot of people doing what we call a step trench, where it's basically a series of steps, right? Carefully controlled excavation, but stepwise, until you sort of locate the horizon where the artifacts or fossils are maybe concentrated. And then once you do that, you can sort of expand out laterally and dig more that way. So that's one big difference. The other is, of course, logistical, right? I mean, in terms of major field projects, I went into this thinking, it's all going to be science. I mean, most of the time is spent, hunting around for the food, getting the day's food supplies, the water supplies, or somebody's sick, the tents are broken. It's that kind of basic stuff that, at least in the projects in New England that I've been in, those didn't take up, the majority of my day. So that's a big difference. And then, of course, the nature of collaboration, where there the work is done with support of and with members from either the National Museums of Kenya or the Tanzania National Museums, where, of course, it's a more sort of patchwork in New England of who you work with and collaborate with. So those are some of the similarities and differences.
What about dating techniques? I mean, so here in New England, we rely very heavily on, radiocarbon dating. And part of that, again, is because we have relatively short time period to deal with. But for deep time, can you talk a little bit about dating? I mean, we know that you work with volcanic ashes, which are really important for dating. But what are some of the, how can you actually explain how that works, and then maybe talk about some of the other dating methods that you use?
Yeah, and most of my own work with volcanic ash isn't really dating the ash directly, as it is matching up ashes. And so volcanoes I often describe them as sort of the world's most complicated plumbing system, and that all that magma churning around, the chemistry of that magma is more or less unique to a given volcano and to a given eruption. And so when those things spit out all that sandy ash all over the place, if you analyze that ash, you can sort of match up different eruptions from the same volcano. And so what this can allow you to do is to sort of link up sites that might be hundreds of miles apart, right? I mean, volcanic eruptions can spit this stuff all over the place. And so you can look at a site, maybe on this side of the valley and match it up with the other side of the valley and know that they're buried by the same ash that fell at more or less the same instant in time. And then you can also sort of match up, if you work in places where there's lots of volcanic activity, like the Rift Valley in Kenya, you can sort of build this sort of sequence of ashes that can link up sites. And that's been a lot of my own work, right? The actual volcanic ashes can be dated directly if you have the right kind. And so what that usually means is that you're actually dating little mineral grains in the volcanic eruption. And minerals are kind of heavy compared to all the little glassy bits that fall out. So what it means is when a volcano erupts, the stuff that falls close to the volcano is easier to date than the stuff that falls really far away. And so a lot of my work was sometimes also trying to match up the stuff from far from the volcano that couldn't be dated to the same parts of the same eruption close to the volcano that can be dated. And so that's the way a lot of that works. And the method used to date it is something called Argon dating. And it basically dates when these minerals form inside the magma body, and then they get erupted during the eruption. And a lot of the minerals that you date sort of crystallize just before the eruption. So you're more or less dating the time of eruption. So that's one of the key methods that we've used. There are other methods. There's something called optically stimulated luminescence. You're basically dating the last time sands got covered up, last time they were exposed by the sun. So that's another. The radiocarbon method works for certainly some of the sites that I work on. It works very well. The problem is that in tropical Africa, charcoal, which is the thing that in New England that's the sort of gold standard for what you want to date. It doesn't really work past about like 7,000 years in Africa. It just doesn't. All the bits you need to preserve just don't preserve. But you can date things like bone or teeth or shell, and each of those things has their own sort of inherent problems. But the radiocarbon method can certainly be used. And then the ones I've been involved in is something called Uranium series, which basically it's dating when, a lot of groundwater has all kinds of uranium and other junk in it. Well, some of that junk gets locked in your teeth, and so you can date when your teeth basically stopped absorbing groundwater, right? Or we were looking at ostrich eggshell, so when the eggshell got buried and sort of, filled up all the sort of uranium it could absorb, looking at the decay of these things, the radioactive decay, and measuring how old things were by that. So those are some of the different methods that are used. There's quite a range. Radiocarbon is still probably the best, but as you said, it doesn't work for a lot of the, past about 40,000 years. Anywhere it doesn't really work. And so for a lot of the time periods related to human evolution, you have to find some other method.
Was there anything that surprised you or stood out as you started to understand these different eruptions and the intervals in between them and the occupation of the landscape, or did something pop out that people are doing weird things during certain times after volcanoes, or?
That's a good question. So at least the stuff that I've worked in, I was never confident enough. It wasn't like we really had sort of pristine volcanic ash being preserved. Sometimes we did, and you could get bits of blades of grass and all this kind of stuff being preserved. But sometimes it's like the volcano would erupt, and then it would wash into a stream, and then the stream would wash it downstream and bury it. And so I never worked on a site where I felt confident that I could say, oh, look, the volcanic eruption seemed to sort of wiped out the landscape and force people to abandon it or something like that. There is work of that scale being done, really good work being done in parts of Europe, for example. But it does seem that overall, ecosystems bounce back really quickly from volcanic eruptions. I mean, even look at Mount St. Helens. It wasn't more than a few years before plants started reestablishing themselves and people moved back to the area. So a lot of that stuff, for the deep time that I work in, you're probably not going to catch that kind of, decade or less kind of response. So I haven't seen anything like that. I would love to find that, but I haven't seen anything that I could confidently link the volcanic eruptions to some sort of human response.
So I guess just to kind of tie all the discussion about dating together, is the broader goal of that, right, is to get a better understanding of how different archaeological sites relate chronologically on the landscape to better date the stone tools and the fossils and things like that. I mean, is that a fair summation, or would you like to add something to? I mean, just to kind of pull it all together.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is just basic building blocks. I mean, for a lot of Africa, even just when did things happen is a big question mark. So being able to anchor some of those basic, when questions is really important. Sometimes it does reveal that people are doing things either earlier than we thought, or it reveals that people were doing things later than we thought. I mean, one of the surprising discoveries of a lot of our work in the Lake Victoria Basin was that, people thought the last 100,000 years, from the point of view of, animals, was boring, because there's some wonderful sites in Ethiopia and in other parts of Kenya, one called Lanyamak, where you've got a really well-dated 300,000-year fossil bed, and it was full of looks like modern animals. And so the thinking for a long time was, well, look, modern animals are on the landscape for the last 300,000 years. We don't need to think about extinct animals that are younger. But we kept finding extinct animals that were much, much younger. I mean, part of this was because nobody had looked, but part of it was because of that dating, right? We were able to show that large parts of the African landscape were, really dominated by extinct animals until maybe 12,000 years ago. So that's a big change. And if not for the dating, we might, if we had just assumed, oh, this is an extinct animal, this site must be older than 400,000 years. Without the sort of radiometric dating, we would have known that to be false. So it really does lead to some surprises in terms of, I think, the world being a more interesting place than we might have assumed otherwise. And
it changes a lot of the story about those people, right? I mean,
that's right.
What were they pursuing? What were they eating? What was eating them?
Right. For sure. And also, it also raises questions about, the human role, what role, if any, humans had in the extinction of some of these animals, right? It's sort of an open question. I think a lot of them probably went extinct because of climate change, but, humans are part of the ecosystem, and it may well be that they played some role in that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, kind of, globally, just, as humans migrated across the globe in different time periods, lots of times that, happened alongside climate change for various reasons that made it easier to get to different places or necessary to leave certain places. But, it's something that we've been grappling with here, I think, in New England as the dates of our, extinct megafauna and human habitation kind of creep closer and closer together.
Right.
We're
Right.
evaluating that relationship a little bit. And we know that in other parts of the country here that humans hunted mammoths and mastodons, but we don't have that solid evidence here in New England. But the dates for their coexistence are slowly starting to kind of get closer and closer. So it very well may be that they interacted on some level, and if they were here on the landscape, I'm sure that they impacted each other in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other part, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say a couple decades ago, that would have been like, a foolish thing to say almost. Of course there were no humans hunting mammoths here, but we're getting awful close.
Right. And I also worry, not worry, well, maybe worry. I think a lot of human impacts on the landscape are maybe more indirect and it could be more difficult to detect, right? The classic one that people are getting more and more clever about measuring are things like deliberate burning of the landscape, right? Sort of modifying things by deliberately setting fires to sort of clear brush, and this changes all kinds of things. And I think detecting when that began locally would be something really important to do. There's been some good studies coming out of Malawi showing that humans have been doing this for a long time, and certainly in Australia it seems to be something that's pretty ancient, and I suspect in North America as well.
Yeah, and I think people are, grappling with some of those questions, trying to get at some of that data through coring, kettle ponds, and things like that. But so far, nobody has come to an agreement on any of that information.
Showing who started the fire is the trick, right?
Right.
And so it's a lot of work to do.
Yeah. But it would be crazy to think that at any place or time that humans and animals didn't have an impact on one another in the environment.
Right.
Well, maybe for the last part of the show, we can switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about your collections-based research a little bit more. We're really interested in that just because, as the Office of State Archaeology, we manage the state's collections, and I love any opportunity to showcase how such collections can be of use to researchers in the future and why they're important and need to be curated and why they need to be kept in good condition so people have them available. So can you just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with collections?
Sure. I can work. I was working with some just today. So I will say that the Connecticut Museum of Natural History collections are an incredibly valuable resource that I'm trying to integrate into many of my classes, right? There are large collections of things that allow students to get a hands-on experience about how to study, what people do, what people did, and the things, the sort of material traces they've left behind of that. And so this is a great resource that I'm just beginning to explore myself, right? Sort of figuring out what's available and what we can look at. I haven't gotten into the Connecticut archaeological collections as much as I would like yet. That's certainly part of the plan, but I have, collections-based research in general, I'll say that I sort of pursued two pathways. One is the stuff, and the other is the papers people left behind. And both have yielded often really surprising things. So in terms of the stuff, I've done quite a lot of work lately looking at collections where people made tools out of obsidian, which is a volcanic glass, it's a lava. But it's chemically fairly easy to identify which volcano these things came from. And people have now developed, from a collections-based perspective, something really important, which are non-destructive ways to analyze it. So in older ways, you had to kind of break off part of the artifact, grind it up, and put it under some machine to get the chemistry. Now you can basically point a laser gun at it, and it gives you the data of equally good quality. And so a lot of that work has been showing some surprising things. We showed us some sites in Kenya that when you predict people to abandon a site and go somewhere else, they didn't. They stuck around and they used the same sort of obsidian source again and again. We've also traced people moving obsidian from Turkey into Lebanon, some 30,000 years ago, over several hundred kilometers. That's some of the collections work. The archival work is also really interesting. Our archives here, in the sense of paper documents, where one of the more interesting ones that I'm working on now is the site called Archaeology in Lebanon, The collections are up at the Peabody Museum in Cambridge at Harvard, and so are a lot of the documents associated with excavation. And one of the things we discovered was this sort of long-lost human fossil. We didn't actually find the fossil, but we found good photographs of it, enough that we can at least get a description of this thing, which doesn't exist otherwise, which comes from a really important sort of 30,000-year-old layer. And so both the things in the collections and also the documents that people have written about them have been wonderful archives. And the last sort of collections-based thing I'll mention are historical aerial photographs. I think not enough people in Connecticut or elsewhere fully appreciate just how valuable these are as sort of snapshots, I guess literally in this sense, of landscape change over time. And so the project I've been doing in Tanzania, we've been really interested in questions about how recent landscape changes have led to erosion and how that erosion impacts the loss of a lot of the archaeological record. And the way we did some of this was we were able to compare photographs from the 1950s, actually 1960, I guess, and today, and to really quantify and measure landscape erosion. And so this same sort of work I know is done in Connecticut, but it just sort of shows, again, sort of in both these sort of very seemingly different places, how a common archival tool, an aerial photograph, can really inform us about how to approach the archaeological record.
Yeah, definitely. And here in Connecticut, the aerial photographs, the historic ones, are available online to researchers, and they've been a tremendous resource for trying to understand, historic
some are
land
available.
use.
Some years that aren't always available.
Well, that's true. So there are some sets that are available,
Yeah.
and some are better quality than others. Yeah, but we do have some, and we have been using them, for historic landscape reconstruction and things like that. They're used very often in cultural resource management projects, as well as people kind of do the background research for a project area to try to get a sense of what might be there.
How do you choose where you're going to look for a collection or an archive? I mean, is it I always picture it as there's a dusty drawer that no one's opened for 100 years.
That's
and
it.
you just happen to be walking by and you find it.
That's it.
Yeah.
That you've nailed it on. You've nailed it on the head. I mean, so in Kenya, for example, the National Museums of Kenya would close for lunch, and so you had to leave the museum. So I would get bored, and I would go to the Natural History Museum, the adjacent Natural History Museum's library, and I would wander and I would read about weird sites I'd never heard of. And then later, I might see some of those collections on the shelf in the museum. So several things were found me just literally wandering the shelves. I found a site, the one I'm studying now, called Kasese II in Tanzania. It was on the shelves in Nairobi in Kenya where it shouldn't have been, and that sort of piqued my curiosity, and that led to me thinking about that one. The other one, called Kenya Hill, was a famous one, and I just sort of was reading up about it, and I looked at the pictures, and what they said they found and what I thought they were didn't make sense. And so that led to me digging these things out and led to a major research project. But a lot of it is just looking through the dusty drawer. Every museum has those collections they don't want to deal with that are tucked away in a corner. And again, if you pester museum curators enough and you look at these things, you'll find these interesting collections. And so some take more active work, right? So that site in Tanzania, I was in touch with the excavators, his wife, who's sadly also since passed away now. But just, she sort of said, look, I've got all this stuff in the closet. Can I send it to you? And so sometimes it's actively looking in corners, and sometimes it's reaching out to people and asking, do you have any information on these collections? But it's a lot of work.
Hey, Doctor, I just wanted to jump in because I love hearing you talk. You started us on our journey tonight talking a little bit about Indiana Jones. Can you share with us, absent of a monolithic ball chasing you down, what was the one artifact, the one find, the one document, the one place, the one location where you channeled your innermost Indiana Jones?
I don't know. There have been some fun times driving some vehicles off-road that felt slightly in that direction. But in terms of finding things, really finding that sort of lost hominid photograph, it sounds really boring, but it was such a sort of bizarre no one thought to look here. Here it is. Here are these photographs. I mean, that for me was sort of a genuine moment of discovery, of recognition of here's this thing people have sort of been looking for, and I've just stumbled across it. It's probably not as dramatic as you might have been hoping for, but I'll stick with that one for the moment.
Related question. You've been attached to, I'm not even going to try my French, Recherche Scientifique in France, the Smithsonian in Washington, GW, NYU, Harvard University, some little place up in the Boston area, and you're back at UConn. Tell me what the program at UConn means to you, and what connects you with your students. What's a good day for you?
The department here is great, right? I mean, it's really it is a program with a vision for how to do things, right? It's not individuals doing their own thing. There's a bunch of archaeologists who have sort of similar, complementary, but not always directly overlapping ways of seeing the world that I think makes a great place to sort of train and learn. What makes a good day for me is when students are engaged, right? I mean, lectures are really boring. Discussions are really fun, right? So when we can sit around and really sort of hash out a real problem. I mean, today, for example, we were going over, I just handed the students a bunch of things, and we sort of walked through how would you approach describing this? How would you approach figuring out how somebody made it? What were the decisions they made? What were the choices they didn't make? And sort of just doing that. That's a lot of fun because it's hands-on. You do things. You can really sort of see the learning process happen. So I do tend to like sort of smaller classes are often more fun for me. But certainly the discussion-based hands-on things are where it's at.
So just sort of as maybe a last question, because we're kind of getting short on time.
Okay.
You're back in New England, you're back at UConn, and you've maintained ties to the area and continued to pursue some interest and some research locally. So what kind of things do you see in the future for your kind of local interest and local research over the next few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I've just signed on to be a member of a PhD committee for a student looking for her PhD thesis on the archaic in Connecticut. So that will be a big part of it. I started doing being a part of some cultural resource management work. So far, only working in Massachusetts for, it's interesting, a firm that is run by people who I knew when they were students at NYU. So it's slow going back for the New England archaeology. So I don't know what my plans are. I think there's a lot of work still to be done in the collections that are stored at UConn in the Natural History Museum, for example. I would love to sort of have the time to sort of start to think about some of those. But I haven't quite gotten there yet, right? I think as for many of us, the pandemic has made survival more of the sort of daily goal than sort of long-term research goals. And so a lot of that stuff has been put on hold a bit more than I might have liked.
Hey, Doctor, quickly, this in from a listener. You mentioned your focus on collection-based research. Are the data contained in collections sufficient to advance your temporal scale research interests? For instance, do you find soil and ash samples in the archive collections documented and in sufficient preserved state to permit further lab analysis? And of course, that came in from a listener because I don't know what half those words mean.
No, that's a fantastic question. Sometimes, but usually the answer is that the archival research tells you, okay, we finished our due diligence with the archival collections. Now we have to go back and dig and really sort of figure it out. Because the reality is that no matter how good somebody did the work when those archives are deposited, let's say 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, I mean, we have learned a few things in the field of archaeology since then. Our excavation methods are better. Our ability to sort of collect information are much improved. And so usually the archival work ends up being a first step. You end up answering a lot of questions, but opening up a lot of new ones. And so for this project in Kenya, at Kenya Hill, there were soil samples available. We did sample those for microparticles of volcanic ash. But the level of precision of where they were recorded just left us with more questions than answers. So we had to go back and re-excavate to get a sense of what was going on. And I think that's sort of a recurring pattern. You do your best with the archives, but they're often setting the stage. Often in a scientific framework, they're providing with pilot data to really say, hey, we've got a really interesting question. Let's go back and see if we can answer it. So I think that's probably the best answer that I can give.
Ground truth, ground truth, ground truth.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I guess that's pretty much all we have time for. Just thank you so much for coming onto the show tonight and talking about this. I hope this is a thing we can continue to do.
Can you share with our listeners how they can follow, and be a part of it? Are you doing the social media stuff? I mean, how can people become what do you call it? A Dungeons fan? What do you call it before? How can people share?
Email. That's as advanced as I get for social media. I would say if they want to reach out by email, that's certainly a way. The Department of Anthropology website has that information there. But no, I don't do Twitter or anything like that. And my Facebook is full of people's kids and cats. Not a lot of work being shared through Facebook. So unfortunately, I always tell my students I do study the Stone Age for a reason. It's a technology I understand the best. So
I was a fifth level cleric, so we'll have to get together and share some dungeon hunts, dungeon crawling. You can follow FOSA on our Facebook page or on the web at fosa-ct.org.
And as always, you can follow the Office of State Archaeology at osa.uconn.edu and on Facebook.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.